whatever it is we do, whatever connections we have with generating knowledge, we have that responsibility to share it. And that sharing of knowledge can never be isolated or insular or out in the suburbs. It always should be shared. And this is a great venue to share it in the middle of the city. And with that, we might think of that as an introduction to really what our subject is tonight. Because in many ways, thinking about curatorship, thinking about museum work, is thinking about that connection between knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge. And if you've been here for a few minutes looking at the images behind you, in many ways I think that's what this is about, is how we think about sharing thinking. And with that, I guess we'll begin. Maybe we have a few moments if instead of introducing each other, we'll introduce ourselves. As I said, I'm out at the Ilam campus. I'm the Dean of Research and Associate Professor of History in the College of Arts. My boss is sitting right here, so you can introduce yourself to Paul, who's the head of humanities. In fact, he's all of our bosses, so we'll watch what we say and be careful. Do come right in, but we're just beginning. Welcome. But we'll introduce ourselves. So anyway, that's who I am. I'm Peter Field, and I'll hand it over for a few moments to my colleagues.
I'm Terry. I am one of the curatorial team for the Artes Museum, and I'll point out Alice English sitting in the audience there is the other half of the curatorial team. I think it's an important thing, it'll probably come up during the night actually, that this is not a singular process, it takes many people. My background is in museums and collections management. I did my undergraduate degree here at Canterbury in social history, New Zealand social history. Studied museums as a masterate program, and then came back and I've worked in all sorts of museums and galleries throughout New Zealand since then. I've been with the local collection since 2012, I think. Came on to manage the conservation project from the earthquakes, and then they just couldn't get rid of me. So yeah, that's who I am.
Hey, I'm Trevor. I'm a recent returnee to the city. I grew up here and did my undergraduate at Canterbury, and history and English, and then went off. Travelled the world, was in Canada for a while, and kind of got into the museum and art gallery business and industry, and spent a good number of years in the UK working at places like the Tate and the National Gallery. And then worked in private institutions as well, like the Lisson Gallery. And it all kind of led on a path to the project that you would have seen behind you, which was a couple of years making the collection, or organising the collection for a new museum in Kuwait. And once that was completed, then I've moved back to Christchurch with my young family, and pitched up at the University of Canterbury, and working at the Fine Arts Department, heading up the technical team.
So we all keep cycling back home again, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
No, we're going to stay. So where do we begin? Maybe a little bit with what is behind us and framing for us a little bit of the parameters of the project from which you last came. And maybe just for those of us, and that includes me, who just don't know, what kinds of parameters are we looking at? How much money, how much time, and what is the conception of a project like this one?
So the title at the moment is the Logie one, sorry. Sorry, the one I worked on in Kuwait, the Sheikh, the king, it was more or less a vanity project. He decided he needed a museum. It needed to be big, and it needed to be built straight away, and it needed to have these sorts of things in it, and he listed out very broad parameters, which was essentially science, natural history, Islamic sciences, and they were the broad brushstrokes that were handed over to a company in London, who then had the honour or the privilege or the challenge of drawing up a museum based on that. So there were architects involved in just designing the buildings, and then they handed it over to a company called Cultural Innovations, who then designed the exhibits. So they said, okay, you want these sorts of things, and there was a bit of back and forth in that process. And then the company that I worked for were engaged to fill those spaces. So the design had been made. It was now our job to get all the lights in, get all the signage in, get all the plinths, get all the objects. And the thing that they discovered straight away when they took on the contract was that the sheikh had no collection whatsoever. So he wanted this museum, but he had no objects to put in it. So I was hired to head up that particular team, which is a team of 3, and we had to source just over 2,000 objects within 2 years and get them made and delivered to Kuwait, ready for installation. That was the scale of it in broad terms. The budget I worked with was approximately £14 million. It's about $28 million, New Zealand dollars. And that was just for the objects. So multiply that by, I don't know, 100 or something, and you can see the scale of the overall project. Because I wasn't involved in the AV or interactives or any of the set works or any of the plinths or any of the lighting, so they were the cost for the project. And so that was essentially the project.
So you made the objects.
I found people to make it.
I think the museums is old objects.
That's right.
We are going to take questions from the floor, which is fine.
Yeah, but I don't think that is. I think museums. So actually, this goes back to when Terry and I. So Peter invited us to have a chat, and Terry and I sat down. And we said, "Well, what are we going to talk about tonight? What's the common thread here?" And we realised that museums essentially are about telling stories. It's an object, but the object is telling a story. So whether it's old and dusty or comes with a lot of history or not, its purpose is still the same. It's to tell a story. And the museum is the site for that storytelling.
You see that?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, Liz, that's how you do fundraising. You find yourself a shape, obviously.
It crossed my mind.
Yeah.
The journey contracts.
You need living in
I
Littleton
lived in museum. Yeah, we lived in museum.
Who is your sheikh, as it were? and because the first slide I did notice that you had in your collection is actually, well, it's certainly not a sheikh, and I don't think Islam is involved, but I'd be interested in knowing that backstory just
I
slightly.
didn't put a slide of David and Lee Teagues either, and I think they probably maybe have a claim to that role. I'll just backtrack a little bit to give you the contrast to what Trevor said about that project. So more of you may be familiar with the story for the Logie. The Logie collection was formed in 1957 when Marion Stephen gifted it to the universities. She'd been collecting since the late 1940s. She was a student and a teacher at Canterbury. She was using objects in her teaching actively with her students. And she was married to James Logie, who was a university registrar at that point in time, from 1950 to 1956. When he died in 1956, she decided that she wanted to set something up that would be a permanent memorial to him. So that's why we know it as the Logie collection rather than the Stephen collection. So in 1957, the university takes possession of the collection. Marion stays on board, and the collection starts to grow slowly over time. And then it's moved location forward. It started out here. When we moved down here, we actually found a really cool piece of paper. One of the interns found it, I think actually was Alice. So when you were volunteering for us, Alice, in fact, it said that when they first had the collection, it was open for one afternoon every Thursday.
Thursday from 4.
Yeah. So it has evolved and changed over its lifetime as well. Leading up to the earthquakes, we were out at Ilam on the 6th floor of the Logie building, and of course, when the earthquakes happened, the collection suffered quite an extensive amount of damage. The university went through a process of conserving all of the material that was broken, and we were really fortunate that we were able to conserve everything and we didn't lose any objects. And then we were in a position where we were sitting there with the whole collection boxed up. It was accessible, but in a very limited way. And so we were able to bring things out for teaching, but we had nothing on display. So then the university started talking to the Arts Centre in about 2013, was it 2012, about the concept of moving some parts of the university down here. And there was some debate about which functions would be best suited to coming down to the Arts Centre. My first notes about the project in terms of the Logie collection started in the beginning of 2014, February 2014. So that's when the idea was pitched to us, and we started kicking off the project proper. So we took from February 2014 to May 2017 to go through the whole process of having a look at the building, figuring out who was going to fit in here, how we were going to fit in here, what kind of functions we were going to be able to offer, how to move the collection safely, how to make sure that we didn't overload any of the flooring loadings, how to get all the HVAC systems, air conditioning systems in that we needed, all of those kinds of things. Our original plan was to be in the building beginning of 2016, so we were only about 18 months over, which is pretty good. And in terms of budget, I don't know what the whole budget was for the building. Paul might be able to comment on that. In terms of the museum specific functions, we had 150,000 for the fit out and 50,000 for the exhibition design and graphics for the first installation. So an exponentially smaller project, but we started with a collection.
That's right. Yeah.
Without a sheet.
And at that point, when you in 2014, when you decided you were going to move in, what state was this building in?
So the building, I think, had been already worked on to a certain extent. So they'd been doing the earthquake remediation at that point in time, but we didn't have any of the interior was still fairly bare. That first walkthrough that we did, they were still actually working on the fabric of the building itself. But the major, the big core rods that go through the building, they were already in place at that point in time. So both building and collection to be put back together again.
Yeah.
So let's think of questions that the audience might think of this group that has an interest in museums, right? I think that's the group that's together, or maybe you're just out tonight, I'm curious. What are some of the things that people probably don't know about what goes on behind the installations that are particularly curious or interesting or strange? And not exactly a kiss and tell, but some strange things that often folks who just see the finished products don't know.
I think the struggle about what the story will be or what the exhibition design will be is a huge challenge, and not a lot of discussion goes on about that. So, people just see it quite broadly as we're going to move the classics collection out to the university, but what's going to happen? How is that going to be exhibited? What works are you going to show? Are you going to show them all? What ones can you show? What ones, So there's a lot of debate about that, and also about keeping it fresh and interesting and alive. So you can set up your opening show, but if you've got a small audience, they can see that exhibit within 6 months. You've exhausted your audience. So you need to refresh and redesign and tell another story and bring out different objects. And I think so much effort goes into that part of museum work. And also the storage. It's like an iceberg really in a museum. You just see the tip, and there's a huge amount of assets that's used for storage. A lot of people work on storage, keeping work safe, fixing them up, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think anyone can build a museum, but keeping it running is actually
Everyone can build your
tricky
museum.
Whether you have 200,000 or 28 million.
I think it does surprise people that you actually need to work on you're not working on getting to day one. I think that's one of the slides that I stuck in was day one, and then I thought, well, there's day 2 and day 3. It's one of the things that actually came out of the earthquakes. I think for a lot of people, you experience a natural disaster, you kind of think, well, the earthquake happened on that day, and then you went on. Well, actually, the earthquakes happened on so many days, and you're constantly adjusting and constantly planning and constantly trying to catch up and keep up with it. And that's kind of what a museum is like too. It doesn't just happen on day one.
Yeah.
You've got all that planning to keep going for ahead of time. And although, Alice, I can see your face now. Okay, we're not always the best at planning as far ahead as we should. But we essentially, like in terms of our exhibition program, we had themes in place so that we would be looking at 4 years in advance. Right now, we've got this exhibition on until February next year, and we've already been working on the following exhibition for the last two months, really, 2-3 months, thinking about it, trying to do research, going out and finding things. The other thing I would say is that I think the background for museums, I think people think that they're always quite harmonious organisations. But there's always that tussle between front of house and back of house. So conservation versus display. We all want to share what we have, but we also want to look after it. And so there's half of us are split between wanting to, yes, here you go, everyone, sprinkle these lovely things around and come in and see them. And the other half of us just want to hunch over the top of them and look after them. So you get that real tussle between collection managers, essentially, curators behind the scenes, and your exhibition designers and installers at the other end. It's a creative tussle though. It's a good tussle. That you need that kind of debate because we can't just be planning for the current generation. We still have to be thinking about future generations as well. So having those 2 points of view coming in, I think, is a useful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked at the Tate and the National Gallery back to back, and in terms of their collection, the National Gallery had a very open policy about putting as much of their work on display as possible. And so they had, at any one time, around 90% of their collection is available to view. The Tate, on the other hand, is just a massive hoarder and collector of items, and so only about 10% of their collection was ever on show at one time.
That's normal for most museums.
Exactly,
Generally
yeah,
less
that's
than
right.
10%.
So you think about 90% of your collection is somewhere else, and it needs to be managed and maintained. And, yeah,
Which doesn't mean that you're not able to share it or that it's not accessible, just that we've got to look for other ways to do that.
Well, you mentioned sort of the interesting tussle or challenge between the front and the back, right? What's on display and what's not.
Sorry.
I think Naomi's top. Sorry, inside joke. But another interesting, maybe not tussle, but relationship, it seems, that might have to be worked out is the one between sort of esoteric knowledge, how it is that the folks who do the daily things are so specialized, and yet what you want to share in a museum, it seems, is that specialist knowledge, but you have to find a way for the folks who just are coming around who don't consider themselves experts to understand the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah.
Isn't that one of the interesting challenges of your particular work?
Yeah, definitely, and I think that crosses into art galleries as well as museums. That you need to be able to give people a key to unlock the story or unlock the work. You don't want to dumb it down and tell the whole story necessarily, but you want to give them enough of a stepping stone or a starting point that they will then take it wherever they want to go, certainly in contemporary art. I think that's a really good thing to do. And even if you go to a museum and you have convinced somebody when they leave that space to go and research that item further, when they go home and Google it or look in the encyclopedia or whatever it might be, I think then you're a success. And that should be the goal of any museum or art gallery.
It's a great challenge for us as a university museum, actually, because that there's a similar challenge for universities, that it's all very well having people sitting in the university gathering all that amazing knowledge together and becoming specialists and experts in very narrow fields, but if you can't communicate that to the rest of the community, the people who actually fund you in the long run, the value of it is diminished as a result. So bridging that gap between what you have to share and what you can share is a really important one for the university. It was an interesting challenge actually for us doing this, thinking about different ways of communicating about the Logie collection and translating the academic style of writing into what was actually going to work for a label, which for that first show probably took us more than a year worth of debate over the labels in order to get them all across the line. And even then, we didn't have universal agreement about what was there. The other thing I would say is that I think, like education, universities too, museums too, have to think about the fact that they're not only there to say this is what we know, they're there to invite people to come in and say this is what we know, what we can tell you. One of the cool things that's happened since we've been here is we've learned an awful lot about Mary and Stephen that we never knew before, and half of that's been through people coming through the doors who've just shared their memories of her. Some of it's been through students taking on projects. Rosalind doing the transcript of the diary, her travel diary this last year. We're actually actively involved in the process of creating new knowledge, and that should be at the heart of really good education.
Yes, I like the modeling of the museum and the university, because they should be connected, if not isomorphic, if not exactly tied together, connected. So on from Terry's point, Trevor, is there something that you do, not just in telling a story, but when you're thinking curatorially or putting together a show, are there questions you think you're asking of yourself? I mean, is that part of what putting together a show is trying to address or ask questions about whether this might work, whether this might be a whole, whether there is a story there?
Absolutely. And sometimes you might realize that the story is dull. It might be a really boring story.
Well, we might like it though.
Yeah, there may be an audience for it. Or you could, just strike out entirely and deliver the dud. You always question your decisions around what stories you choose to tell and why you tell them. And I think it goes back to your earlier point about that fierce debate about what's the institution going to do, and why is this story more important than this story? Why are we telling this one now and not this one? It's an ongoing struggle.
Do you find you need to be, there's so many questions that I want to hit the really sensitive ones in public. But is there a particular challenge too in having so many different hats you wear? So you've mentioned the one of curatorial, preserving knowledge, telling the story, sharing knowledge. And then there's finding the sheep, right? Or finding money. This is an expensive enterprise, isn't it? So doesn't that mean you also have to have a certain talent for dealing with your donors, with your clients? And those people often have a lot of money, and they may have a certain sense of what must be out there and what it must mean for them. And I'll speak, again, this doesn't leave the room, right? That often academics struggle, right? That some of them are very good researchers, not as good teachers. It seems we're asking curators to have a whole host, a whole bunch of tools in their toolkit. And that must be very difficult, very real world problems of people with money. How does that go?
That is a real struggle. They often want to influence the program. They may say, certainly in Q8 it was his show, and we may not have agreed with some of the decisions around what he wanted in the exhibit. But I think getting down to just smaller donors, they may, my friend's an artist, I think you should give them a show. You often get those sorts of conversations where they try and influence the program, and they expect to influence it. That's what they think they maybe are buying into, and you've got to convince them, no, they're a stakeholder with a different responsibility. And sponsors who may want their product shown in your museum or gallery, or if you sell the rights to a gift shop or sell the rights to a canteen to another company. So there's all those sorts of commercial pressures that are placed on an individual or on an institution. But they're part and parcel, as you say, of modern museums. And even in ancient times, there was always a benefactor, wasn't it, who was sponsoring it and paying for the space to exist, who obviously would have some sort of say on what should go on and what shouldn't go on in the space.
terms of the multitasking, it's one of the really cool things about working in museums. Actually, most museums in New Zealand are relatively small. I mean, there's really only 4 big ones around, so most of us are working in this field, in small to micro museum sized, as they're now called. A lot of them run on volunteer help, you know. So in terms of the team here, for instance, we've got Alice and I working with the museum, we've got gallery hosts and interns who help us out behind the scenes, and we've got the team that actually run the building, so Naomi and Michaela, our administrators. Pretty small team. It puts a lot of pressure on you to be able to do all sorts of things, but it also gives you the opportunity to do a lot of things. You know, it means it's a really varied job. So you know, one day you'll come in and we'll be going, you know, to Canterbury Museum to have a look through drawers and drawers and drawers of things, thinking about what we might want to borrow for the next museum. The next day, Alice is designing an activity book for schools, or we're talking to potential donors. The day after that, you might be doing dishes upstairs for a public event. So the variety in it is something that I really enjoy, that you're not always stuck doing the same kinds of things. Sometimes it feels like endless emails, but yeah, the variety in it is a great thing. And at the end of the day, I think the people who manage to flourish in that are people who enjoy making connections, who enjoy building relationships with people. Because whatever you're doing, you know, literally I've spent days in Mariah kitchens in a museum job where you're just helping out because there's been there's a tangi coming out, or we've had to be up on the roof of the museum once clearing out gutters. When I worked up at Kaikoi, it doesn't matter what the job is if you're making connections with people, building those relationships. It will actually come back into the institution in the long run, and that's what causes it to flourish.
You said there were there's only really 4 museums in New Zealand?
But no, big ones,
Which
the
are?
big ones, Auckland,
Yeah.
Te Papa,
Right.
Christchurch and Otago, Canterbury and Otago, yeah. I mean, they're the ones where they actually have the ability to have a depth of specialist staff. Although it's interesting to see what's happening at Te Papa at the moment, and
That's right.
the shedding of specialist staff.
That's right.
I don't want to go there.
No,
The
probably
cynic
shouldn't.
in me read Trevor's question differently, which was, you would call these large museums?
No.
Right? Coming from the Tate, I'm sure you didn't mean that. And you wouldn't do that. Yeah, you wouldn't do that. But coming from, say, the Tate, you might not say that actually these are large museums. But actually that is something, the scale and the size is worth addressing in some interesting way. That obviously you can say, oh, there's much less, but the notion of having opportunity and the opportunity to do various things, where I imagine if one's at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., or at the Museum of Modern Art or something, no matter what you are, you're a very small cog in a very large organization.
Yeah.
And so there's something to be said for how many museums and how much is on display in New Zealand, even if it's, you know, really very small things in Harada, or little piece of Christchurch, or out in Hakatika. The scale is sort of fun, I think Terry's
The
saying.
smaller
This
museums.
is, we're trying to keep you. This is our lure.
Did we have an argument about the O'Kane's Bay Museum? We did, like a friend.
Argument?
Not an argument, a debate.
A robust discussion.
Has anyone been there? How many of you have been to O'Kane's Bay? Right, so you've got a good group.
And it's like amazing the things they have there. It's really a fantastic collection. But the storytelling is appalling. And it's not
In your view.
In my
In
view.
your
In my
view.
view. It's not very coherent. But those places are fantastic. Absolutely wonderful artifacts, and there are stories there that are just not coming out very easily.
You often walk into those kind of places, and it's the stories that you bring with you that end up coming out, or the stories that other people alongside you. You know, when we were talking about that, I was thinking about the fact I do volunteer work for Hororata Museum, which at this point in time is very much like, it's like a really cool junk shop. You know, basically.
Right.
That's the
And
story.
None of
That's
the
the
committee
story.
would be worried about me saying that either. And when you do walk in, you hear a lot of people talking, oh, I remember when we were little, and it's the kind of sentimental value that often comes out. But the deeper stories, yeah, I agree, they don't yet appear because you can't expect people to know those just by looking at the objects.
But to speak to Trevor's point slightly, the real interesting challenge is to leave enough available so viewers can identify with what they want, they can see what they want, but also to help them tell their story. So to help contextualize it so that it has more meaning than they might have brought with it is also a good thing to do. And that what I think good exhibits really do is lead you in that direction. So you go from recognition to also putting it in a perspective that you hadn't quite remembered it or hadn't quite seen it or hadn't framed it in that way. And that's the really imaginative thing, right? That's the real challenge, I think, of curating is having that sense of being able to reach out to people. As a teacher, it's really quite similar. If you don't understand what you think people are about, then you're not going to reach them with your stories very easily.
It's a
I think
balance.
cocaine's big. Sorry.
I was just going to throw it. It's
Please.
a balance between not saying enough and saying too much as well. Because I've been in a lot of exhibits where there's so much story that you just can't process it all. And for someone like me who feels like you have to read every single label, it's a really stressful experience when you go in and there's just too much information and you cannot process it in enough time. I mean, those small museums, I think what the part of the appeal about them still is that they have their own character and a kind of a silence to them, which is quite restful by comparison to a lot of new exhibits, which are so busy and so full of
Sure.
everything that it's hard to find.
Like, this is a really good example of that, where, so we made these nice objects and put them in this museum, but then they've made these plates with disco lights along the bottom, which you see there, which I think is like so tacky. And as you say, like that busyness of that exhibit now, so it's taking away from the object and perhaps the story you're trying to tell and what these objects are and when they existed. You've got like a disco going on in this place. There it is. Great view there of it. So yeah, it's a good point.
I think sometimes what it does in the end is tell people that that this is the story, this is the only story, because it's so overwhelming. You keep your story to yourself. Unless we allow a little bit of space there, as you would, in a lecture for people to come backwards and forwards and tell their stories and bring their knowledge to it. We kind of squash that out a little bit.
One would hope. So I think it's probably a good time to maybe include others in this if we want to do that. We could start with some, yes, you've had your hand up and some questions. How are you? You may want to introduce yourself briefly and ask a question.
I appreciate you aren't connected with this institution, but I'd be curious about your comments about the display policy of the Canterbury Museum. I've lived in New Zealand for 19 years now. Love going to museums. I'm aware that the Canterbury Museum's got a permanent collection of about 2 million objects. I may be mistaken, but in the entire time I've lived here, it never once changed any of the permanent exhibits, and it's disappointing.
Certainly, I'm not going to comment on it. I'm straight away, that's what my answer is.
Do you want to comment on it?
We're both looking, we're looking to you.
I've been in the country less than a year, so I can't possibly comment on the Canterbury Museum's exhibition policy. But it's a good point. I mean, I think that's probably true of a lot of museums where they have so many objects in storage, and whether they struggle to find stories to tell, or they struggle to get money to do exhibition changes, or maybe it's their audience. They've decided that the audience is predominantly tourists, and they're going to tell a very straight story, the same story over and over again. I really don't know. I can see that they are certainly struggling.
So I can comment to a certain extent. I did work at Canterbury Museum for 2 years as the manager of the collection management team there. So we were behind the scenes rather than front of house, and that does make a difference. I think that there was a lot of feedback about that. There is a lot of feedback from Canterburyans particularly, that they don't see a great deal of change going on at Canterbury Museum.
from the behind the scenes perspective, I can say that with such a big collection, there was a huge task in trying to actually come to grips with the collection. A lot of it is catalogued to a very basic level. A lot of it is not digitised yet. A lot of it there was damage to the earthquakes, but there was, had been a series of other things happen that meant that there's a lot of time and effort needed to put those things right. And the sheer enormity of that kind of task often overwhelms what you can do front of house. So I think that there was a decision seemed to me, from my perspective, a decision to concentrate on what you could change easily. So that's your travelling exhibitions and your changing exhibitions rather than your permanent galleries, to allow that time for other things to go on behind the scenes. Because until you had control over your collection, you don't know what the stories are. You don't know how you can tell those stories. You also can't plan effectively for the future without control over the basic asset. We were fortunate. Local collection's only 372 options. So, it didn't take a long time for us to catalogue, and we've still got cataloguing to do. The other thing is that I know that there was a couple of the galleries that they did look at changing over time and did make some changes too. And as soon as they made those changes, Canterbury Street is the one I'm thinking of, the shops and everything, they got such stick from the public about changing that because people remembered it. It was a sentimental thing for people coming through, that they would reminisce about when they would go through as a child and experience that as a child, and so that the actual feedback from the local community about changing that was overwhelmingly negative rather than positive. Now, it might have been a situation there where it was the negative voices that were louder and the positive voices just didn't give them any feedback. But I do remember that it was hard to make some of those changes because people got used to what was already there.
It raises another good point, which we haven't really touched on, which is why do we collect? And when I did my museum degree, I did it in Canada, and the very first question was, why do we collect? And on day one of the course. So somewhere like the Canterbury Museum has 2 million objects. I don't know if that's true, but if it does, that seems outrageously, an outrageous amount of objects to have. Are they still collecting? Or have they said, no, we only collect until a certain date? What's the mandate? And I think institutions need to look at that and reflect and think, why are we buying this work, or why are we sourcing this work, or why are we keeping it? What's the goal here? What's the mission? A good example is the art gallery here. It does purchase artworks, but it doesn't. Sorry.
We get it.
Yeah.
Outside.
But what is its policy? What is it going to collect? Is it going to collect Christchurch artists, or New Zealand artists, or international artists? Is it going to collect sculpture? Is it going to collect painting? I think you need to define your collection, otherwise you can end up with a collection of 2 million objects and not be able to show them, which kind of defeats the purpose, perhaps.
There was a long period where museums were just collecting as much as they could get their hands on, really. But there is more of a push these days, probably in the last 5 to 10 years, to get people not only to go back to their collection policies again, but also to consider rationalising collections, which at one point in time, if we mentioned that word, it would have been, a sent to hell straight away.
The accession.
But there is, particularly in the UK now, a lot more of a move to have another look at collections and consider, is this the right place for these objects? Or do we actually have too many examples of, stovetop irons? Can we tell the story with 5, or do we really need 500 of them? And to think about whether or not we need to actually let go of things and not just hold on to. It's a scary prospect for a lot of museums, isn't it?
Quickly, I'm going to say quickly that I'm glad we've moved on from the Canterbury Museum, because there's no one here really to defend the museum, and so we probably might do a little bit of that at some point, in saying that they're pretty kind. I'm going to quickly just ask one question, and then we'll move on. Just, is there a move, and is it an interesting move, quickly, for museums to actually show what they're about in some way? So I've noticed certainly the new Whitney Museum in the United States in New York has actually gone about trying to show you a little bit more and break down that wall of what's behind and stored and what the museum's job is and literally what's on exhibition. So that they sort of have ways that you go through some of their storage, and some of their storage is shown, and breaking down that wall. Is that a way where museums can maybe make some progress between, it's a way of changing anyway, and showing what they're about.
I think Auckland has that, haven't they? You've got windows, you can look into the collection rooms
That's
or
right.
where the staff are working on a conservation project.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of gesture at showing it, at not making things hidden and revealing process as part of what you do and what's valuable. Hi, you first. I'm not sure. I don't know you, but if you introduce yourself and then this gentleman.
I'm Liz Grant, and I'm here because I've got the Littleton Museum hat on. And I just was talking about that. I'd like to comment on that whole business of collection policies. The importance of having small local museums, of course, is they tell the small local stories, which are really important. But what has often traditionally happened is the local community says, oh, we've got these things, and we don't want them anymore, but the museum would love to have them.
Exactly.
And and often that's how, for a small local museum, that's how something develops, so that you do get 94 Flatirons, and what do you do? So I think, for us, because our collections in storage and we don't have a building, but we're working on that, we are developing a collections policy. So that we've spent some time thinking in broad parameters what kind of stories we will want to tell. We've got a house and a home, and from now on we'll try and control the kind of collection policy that we have. But that is quite a pressure for small museums in local communities, because of course you want to reflect your community, but your community doesn't always understand what the issues might be about having 94 Flatirons.
But if you've got a strong policy, that's your defence often against that. You can say, look,
Yes.
this is what we're about. That's why we don't need 94 irons.
That's right, but
Yeah.
the difficulty is that often that museum has started because it's been a group of enthusiastic, keen community people who said, we need a little museum. And it is through community generosity that you've got any objects at all.
That's right.
And then suddenly you have to make this kind of policy change, but still keep your community engaged with who you are. But it can be quite a tricky balancing. So that's just, do you mind if I just tick on just once more? Because one of the other questions I was having is, and it was something that Terry alluded to, is that we all know in museums that you've got too many words on the wall, and actually people will read less. But I think we're in quite a blessed age. We can put less on the wall, but we've got digitisation. So if you engage people's interest by what they read on the wall, like you keep it brief, you can actually offer them a whole lot more through your digital labelling, which can be written a much greater length, and maybe, in more expert language, but what you present. So in the TIS, you've done something like that. haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, the digital platforms offer us a huge benefit in terms of layering information. Absolutely. So one of the things that we did for the first show was we had labels for the objects for We Could Be Heroes for the opening show. We had a limit of it's supposed to be 100 words, but sometimes it was 125. So let's say 100 to 150 words. And then we put all of that information online in an online exhibition, and they were the long labels, so they could be anywhere between 250 to 500 words. And then we also had the catalogue developed for the exhibition, so that had the academic essays in it. So we were trying to create layers that people could choose to go to if they wanted to, but in that first instance to keep it brief, to keep it simple, and to try and make them accessible to the widest possible
audience.
I imagine the challenge to Littleton would be finding someone to do that work. That's a lot of work to put together those.
You're looking at a writer there, so.
Okay.
I'll tell you one project
Hi.
I did work on, which was a huge challenge. I was one of the writers who did when they refurbished Tortue down in Otago, the Otago Sickness Museum. And they, as an institution, made a deliberate policy that no label would be more than 50 words, unless it was an introductory label, and then it's 75 to play.
Hi.
So,
I'll just return to this issue about tension between conservation on the one hand, exhibition and sort of an audience.
Can you speak just a little louder, just
Yes,
in case
so
people can't hear you?
it's about engagement of your audience, but at the same time, you know, the conservation part to your work. So Te when it first got going, was beyond criticised because it wasn't a pure museum, it was people say it was an entertainment parlour rather than a museum. But then when the crowd started to come in, I think people sort of started to say, yes, this is a way that we can engage people that are interested in museums. And then I was in Tasmania, and there was this Museum of Modern and Old Art. And it's the most amazing place. It's redefined for Australians what it is, what a museum is about, because you can go there and you can see a piece of amazing modern art against an Egyptian coffin or whatever it might be. And it's just dragging people in because they're so engrossed and so enamored with this way of presenting. So where do we go? Like you've got, on the one hand, your own museum theory, which is, obviously an historical significance, but can you in a way envisage that you would develop it in the way that these other museums are opening up and trying to get a broader audience?
I think that goes back to that whole day one concept that we have to be continually developing and continually changing. We have to keep looking forward to the future and thinking about what are we going to become. And for us, it's important to do that within the context of the university. Because first and foremost, that's who we serve. We're here to promote the teaching and learning that goes on within the university system. So, in terms of the short term, one of the things that I'm very, very keen on is that the collection and the museum begins to be seen as a place that's not just teaching one kind of subject, but is seen as a place for teaching all subjects, for any subject, for any discipline, to want to come down here and use it for a teaching venue, and to see that they can explore with different kinds of teaching techniques, particularly thinking about experiential learning opportunities, looking at inquiry-based learning and things like that. That's short term, but long term for us, we should be rethinking it. And personally, I think that our students should be helping us with driving that, thinking about where we're going to go from here. We have to be careful about balancing out what's going to work for the community and what's going to work for the university in the long run. Sometimes they intersect. Where they do intersect, that's great, but sometimes they don't. And at the end of the day, then we have to decide, all right, who are we going to be best served and help them.
Do we have any big secret plans for some new museum or?
Can I possibly comment?
That's a yes, I'm okay. Hi.
I have a question for both of you. So, in relating a little bit to the totally different origins of projects that you worked on. So, Trevor, what would have been the one most useful restriction to have on the project that would have prevented you from doing something that would have actually made the project easier? And Terry, if you had unlimited budget, what's the one thing that you would have wanted to do that you couldn't do within your existing project?
The dreadful answer.
The problem we had was that the list was fixed. So it was, you need to buy 6 spaceships and you need to get 20 of these. And as the museum became real and we got down to the nitty-gritty, how's that object going to go next to that object? And how's it going to sit on this platform in this showcase? We realised that things needed to change, and they couldn't change. So we were stuck buying a spaceship because that's what the king wanted. And that's what the contractor said we would supply. So we had all this money to get great objects, but they weren't necessarily the most appropriate things.
You want
that
to
was
stab
a
at that or
budget.
no?
We definitely should have a dishwasher, don't you think? All right, I'll be completely honest. Seeing as, it's not going beyond this room. If we had blue sky thinking, because I do think when we approach this project, there's lots of different ways of planning. Sometimes you've got the big idea, sometimes you're planning for the worst case scenario. I think that what we ended up doing was more of the same, but better. We went for the equilibrium kind of level. I'm glad I see Paul nodding now. And we have been able to be clever and experiment in places, but for the most part, we've done what we were doing before, but we've done it a bit better. If we'd had unlimited budget, I would have liked to see, now I can see Alice laughing at me. I would want more space. I would want more galleries, multiple galleries, and I would have liked to see us considered as not just a solo collection, but part of a plethora of collections that the university has to offer. Because in my experience, working as the art curator for the university, I'm aware that we have huge, amazing resources out there that are just untapped at the moment. They're tapped by certain people, shall I say, or certain disciplines. But the combined stories that they could tell would just be fantastic. They would just, the power of it would be amazing. So art collection, rare books collection, archives collection, photos. There's a collection in forestry, in chemistry. There's a accounting collection. There's a collection of maths models. There's just so much out there. And if we had the opportunity to bring those people together, we could have just blown everyone out of the water. I think we really could have done something amazing. But you've got to start small.
Sure.
I have a question for, this is fascinating. I have a question for each of you. Trevor, my question is around, you mentioned the sort of Islamic science. That sounds fascinating to me, and I just wonder whether there was a tension there between maybe talking about the scientific perspective that's an Islamic scientific perspective. Does that conflict with what, some of the things you would have expected?
Right.
And just quickly...
And we'll come back. We'll get your question retired from.
No, it's not. I think that's the wrong interpretation of what that space was. It's more like a historic museum, so looking at their early objects that they used in their sciences, which predated the Western equipment. But of all the museums, because there were several, it's not dissimilar to your model, on site, that was the one that had the most scrutiny in the planning and production process. So they being the QATs, were very attentive about the process of fitting those items and sourcing them, and would attend more of these visits, these studio visits, for that particular museum than the other ones. And we had to make a lot more changes in those spaces to the object. So as much as we had our shopping list, there were these checks along the production process where the item would be looked at by myself and a couple of experts to make sure it's correct, it's meeting all what we signed up to make. And for that particular museum, it was much more stringent, and they attended a lot of those visits. And we had to make changes. And one thing we did have to do in the other museums was we had to remove all genitalia because that was culturally insensitive. So,
How do the animals feel about that?
and the people who were most upset were the designers. Who,
Of course.
who were saying, like, this is not a true replication of that ram.
No sweetness.
Did you answer rams or horny animals? Paul?
So, Terry, when I first sort of got associated with the Logie collection, I was surprised to learn that there are objects we couldn't take. We get people who would say that this gorgeous sort of important object of classical antiquity, and rather than say that's great, there would be furrowed brows and worried looks, and I just wondered if you wanted to tell us a little bit about the complications of provenance.
Yeah. So we've, as Liz has mentioned, we've gone through the process of creating collection policy for the Logie as well. When it was founded, Marion did create a statement about what she wanted to see in the collection. The funny thing is that there are definitely things in the collection already that were not in the groupings that she mentioned. Her primary interest was a Greek painted ceramic. That's what she wanted to see in the collection. She wasn't, not too opposed to Roman, but none of that none of that Egyptian stuff, none of the Middle Eastern stuff, and nothing modern as well. So we have snuck things in there that we probably shouldn't have. So it took us, a year and a half to develop a collection policy in terms of drafting things out, going through the process of negotiating backwards and forwards with the classic staff, the academics who are really familiar with the collection. And we did set boundaries in there. One of the primary interests for us in terms of antiquities is to be sure that we're collecting items that are ethically and legally acquired. And the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people who have collected antiquities in the past, or still collect antiquities, have paid little attention to that. For us, it's a big issue because with antiquities, you often get them coming out of countries where they're experiencing conflict or war. You get them coming out of sites that are actually being looted rather than being excavated with authority. Or you get them, particularly in terms of art collections, you get them coming out of collections where the material's actually been stolen. So our interest there is in trying to put up a framework where we had some ability to select objects that had some kind of provenance with them, and some kind of is probably the most specific I can be. We try and get objects that have a good sale and purchase record, at least, it would be nice back to 1900s, if not before that, but at the very least back to the sort of 1940s, so that we can predate them to the war, to the Second World War. And we have on occasion been offered a collection. You're probably thinking about the Coolbeck collection, where it was a person probably collecting in completely good faith, from what we can tell, but who kept no purchase records. They did not keep receipts. And out of the collection of about 52 objects, we only accepted 5 or 6, where they had, for some reason or other, actually kept some auction records for those items, so we were able to say, okay, they go back to a certain level. There's an extent to which, when we're doing that kind of purchasing, then making replicas would be so much easier. You're also playing a risk game. If you're looking at big ticket items, then you are going to want to be rock solid on your provenance these days, because there's a lot more of a push from cultural communities to consider repatriation. And if you're going to end up in that situation, you want to know where you stand legally. But if we were being offered flat irons, for instance, you might think, well, there's less risk involved here if we don't know exactly where that's come from, because then we're not likely to have too many people asking for their flat irons to be repatriated. I have been involved in a return of items from Nelson Museum where they were fairly domestic objects, actually, but it's not a common occurrence. So, does that answer my question?
We have time for just a few more questions. I certainly want to ask one before we leave, or ask you to speak to something. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And we have these on the first Tuesdays of the month, and we feel that they're important for us to share, and also for us to make sure that we get out and remind ourselves that we have a university in a community. And that leads me to the question, which is, how do you find the interaction with students? Are they giving great input? And are they getting a lot back? And could you imagine could you tell us how bereft you think the university would be without having TIS and without having, a fine arts collection? What that might mean? Or is that too fat a pitch to throw over the plate? But I think it's worth at least mentioning students in some way or other.
I just want to ask Trevor a question, because you've seen what he's done. Took in Tate and all those huge galleries, and now you're back working as a senior technician in our School of Fine Arts.
Yeah.
And I just wonder how that is for you.
You're my boss, so I can't possibly comment. I think because the city is rebuilding itself, and I think the university is as well, and particularly the Fine Arts Department is redefining itself, and so there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm hopeful, and I have seen it already, that I'm going to be able to apply some of my skills and knowledge and take on some extra duties and roles within the school.
I mean, it says you've got so much you could offer our students, and well, obviously we recognise that, but where do you see the opportunities?
So certainly in terms of the students with the postgraduates, and I think that's happening already, the way we've structured the team, is that the other technicians are doing more of the day-to-day work with the undergraduates, and I'm based in the building where most of the postgraduates are, and the others are just across the bridge. And the plan is that I'm more involved in their practices, so I'm going to be involved in the next round of crits that they do, and be more involved in that exhibition making kind of decisions that they should make, and give advice on how to make an object, or how to present it in a gallery, or how to think about showing it, that sort of thing. Because I think that's a skill to have, as exhibition making is quite different than object making. You can be really good artisan and make a great object, but how are you going to show it? And that goes back to our story thing, like why do you want to show it? How are you going to show it? What do you want the experience to be for the viewer? How do you want them to negotiate the object or painting, or whatever it might be? So, yeah, and there's certainly that opportunity to do that. And getting back to your question, I think the students, I think it is more the postgraduates who have more interest in that sort of thing, the thing that you were touching on, like our collections and our spaces. The undergraduates, I think they're still so young generally. They're finding their way in the world and finding, is this the right degree, and that sort of thing. Whereas postgraduates have chosen to come back or carry on their studies because that is a real interest. And so therefore, I think there's more opportunity to marry up with that group of students.
Do you think Terry would like to say more than nah?
You would know.
It was a very blasé answer. I can get away with it because the students can go with it. One of the concerns that I had actually when we were first told about the idea about moving us down here was that distance for us from campus might put the connection with teaching and learning with the students at risk. And there was always a bit of a debate there, because the physical separation of the collection now from campus means that there will be some students who decide that actually coming down here is just too much of an effort. And maybe that then demonstrates how important I think the students are to what we're doing. That I think they're absolutely central. The whole function of what was enshrined in what Marianne wanted for the collection was that it continued to be teaching and learning. But the fact that we exist within a university means that that should be a given anyway. We should be about teaching and learning. And most museums these days think they're about teaching and learning as well. And for me, the students, the ability that we have to add to their education is actually, and we're not fulfilling it at the moment. We could do a hell of a lot more than we are currently. something I think we could be made better use of in a lot of different arenas. And I would say at undergraduate and postgraduate level, my experience working with the art collection was that undergraduates actually were interested in the collections, but their teachers were unsure about using it in their courses, or they didn't feel confident enough about what object-based learning or inquiry-guided learning might look like in a university course, so they weren't requiring students to access those collections. Whereas I think that objects have such a huge ability to connect with students, to tell those stories, to give them emotional responses to their learning, to reinforce the joy that they're having in learning, and for them to bring their own stories to it, which then actually helps them to construct the new knowledge that they're supposed to be there to do. And I think in the future, perhaps one of the things that we need to do is, in the past, I've been trying to convince teachers to use the collection. What's been a joy seeing as we've been down here, and these guys are a really good testimony to that, is the students are actually beginning to take that process into their own hands. So maybe we should just be going to the students first, and the teachers will have to follow us.
That's what we do.
Like today I turned up a little early, checking the game here, and there was a class in the museum, a full class of students actually in the museum sitting down having a class. And I thought that was fantastic, absolutely wonderful. The objects that they're learning about are right there in the room. So yeah, that's brilliant.
It was one of the nice things when David Tess was looking at whether they would sponsor it or not, and he heard that we had a teaching collection, and he found it very off-putting because he thought it was a sort of just a few odd bits and pieces that got handled around. And so he took the catalogue and he took it to one of the big museums in New York, and was told that they've got a lot of things that we should probably have. And that was when he first realised that our teaching collection wasn't just a few old shards, as people would call them, but actually they were world-class significant objects, and students got to get up close to them and actually handle them and engage with them. And that's, I think, one of our important points of difference and opportunity that we don't really make enough of.
I'd like to add to that too, just from the perspective that I have of seeing the activity that happens in this building, that I would say that the students who engage with the collection are some of the most engaged students I've seen in any area of study. And certainly what I noticed with, for instance, the Classic Club, who are the classics, for those of you that don't know, there's the Classical Society, so the student-run club. They are a really, really engaged group of people, and I think that is probably, I would assume, to do with the fact that they have this resource that they can engage with that is just so amazing. And that, imagine if every subject had a similar kind of, or knew of the fact, because obviously there are these unknown collections and stuff, but if every subject had that opportunity, what that might do in terms of student engagement and real kind of meaningful interaction.
Kind of a nice note to think about bringing things to a close. Another question? Another comment?
There must be room for a lot more museums, I think. There could be 20 museums in Christchurch of all different types. The types you get in Europe, and and how to engage with community and with commercial interests and with trusts who might want to back these kind of things and even get the collections out of the university and into some foyer or something like that, or you teaching not just people classics but also how to make museums, how to design museums. We've got such expertise here. Heading over to O'Kane's Bay and kind of reorganising the whole thing for us.
So true. I would so love that.
Sounds like we have a new prospective board member. That's what
Summer holiday.
There must be just people out there who would, if they thought they could leave their, inheritance to something like that, and there were people around who would manage it professionally. And maybe you already do that.
If you'd like to leave your inheritance, I'm here to talk to you about that. I saw him too.
Indeed, it is a very heartening comment to make. And the young people on the whole, the 17, 18-year-olds that we get to meet, really have a fast food experience in many ways in their life generally. And museums are one of those places where, for their own good, for sure, they slow down some. And that's one of the really wonderful things that museums can offer us. And they don't just conserve the objects, maybe they conserve a certain way of life. That would be a world sadly lost. And it's got nothing to do with objects, but with people. So if I take your point, it's really true. And we could do more to engage those who are interested in one of the things. Well, I guess it's a moment to say thank you to Terry and Trevor, who have taken some time out and who have. I'm going to invite you to do that in a moment. Yes, I know. Paul could do it himself, but we want. Sorry. Where was I? Oh, yes. I was going to make a little bit of a facetious remark about how it's nice to have folks come out from behind the scenes in front of everyone. But as you can tell, I think from this presentation, that Trevor and Terry are quite comfortable in exploring and explaining what goes on and are often as much the face as well as the behind-the-scenes experts. And for that, I think everyone here today would attest that we're very grateful for your articulateness. So thank you for that. Join me.